The secret raid that changed everything. Inside operation, absolute resolve. What happens when the most powerful military on Earth decides to cross a line that hasn't been crossed in generations? When American special forces descend from the night sky into a foreign capital to capture a sitting head of state, this isn't a Hollywood script, this isn't a Tom Clancy novel, this is what happened in January 2026, and the reverberations are still shaking the foundations of international law, military doctrine, and geopolitical power. I'm talking about Operation Absolute Resolve, the mission that captured Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, and what you think you know about this operation barely scratches the surface. Let me paint you a picture of what really went down that night, because this wasn't just another military operation. This was a statement, a declaration, a moment that will be studied in war colleges and debated in international courts for decades to come. Picture this. Nearly 200 American soldiers, the cream of the crop from our Special Operations Forces, converging on Venezuelan soil under cover of darkness. These aren't regular troops. These are the operators you never see, the ones whose names remain classified, the ones who train for scenarios that most people can't even imagine. They're launching the most audacious raid since the Bin Laden operation, but with one crucial difference. This time they're going after a sitting president of a sovereign nation. The helicopters cut through the night air, big birds, heavy with equipment and soldiers approaching their target, and then it happens. The night erupts. Machine gun fire tears through the darkness. The pilots are landing these massive aircraft when they get hit, point-blank range. Machine guns trained directly on the cockpit. 3 American pilots take rounds to their legs. President Trump himself described it as pretty badly hit in the legs. These men are fighting to keep control of tons of metal and machinery, while bullets are shredding through the cockpit around them. But here's where it gets interesting, because despite the chaos, despite the incoming fire, despite 3 wounded pilots, the mission doesn't falter for a second. American snipers are already in position. They neutralize the threat. The operation continues, and within minutes, it's over. Maduro is in custody. The Venezuelan leader who had defied American pressure for years, who had survived coup attempts and economic sanctions, who had maintained his grip on power through a combination of Cuban backing and Russian support, is now sitting on an American warship, the USS Iwo Jima, heading toward New York to face drug trafficking charges. Let that sink in for a moment. The United States military just executed a raid on foreign soil to capture a sitting head of state, not a terrorist hiding in a compound, not a warlord in a failed state, a president. Of a country that, while troubled, still has embassies around the world, still sits in the United Nations, still has diplomatic relations with numerous countries. Now, I want you to understand something crucial here. This operation didn't happen in a vacuum. Maduro wasn't just some strong man the United States didn't like. He was under indictment in the United States for drug trafficking. The DEA had been building cases against him and members of what they called the Cartel of the Suns, high-ranking Venezuelan officials accused of turning their country into a narco-state. But there's a massive difference between having an indictment and actually going in to get someone. That difference is everything. And the Trump administration decided to cross that line. 7 American soldiers were wounded in total during the operation. Let that number sit with you. 7 Americans came home injured because their country sent them to capture a foreign leader. But look at the other side of this equation. 83 people died on the Venezuelan side, members of their security forces. And here's something that hasn't gotten enough attention. 32 of those killed were Cuban soldiers. Cuban forces defending a Venezuelan president, killed by American Special Operations troops. This isn't just a bilateral incident between the United States and Venezuela. This is a regional confrontation with casualties from 3 different nations. But President Trump, standing at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, surrounded by military families and the operators who carried out this mission, framed it very differently. He called it spectacular. He called it incredible. He said the world saw what the American military could do, and he revealed something that's gotten lost in all the headlines about the capture itself. He talked about a weapon he called the Disorienter. Listen to his exact words. They even talk about the Disorienter because they were never able to fire a single shot. The Russian equipment didn't work. The Chinese equipment didn't work. Everyone's trying to figure out why it didn't work. Stop and think about what he's saying here. Venezuela had Russian military equipment. They had Chinese technology, and according to the president, none of it functioned during the raid. Some kind of American system, this Disorienter, neutralized their communications, their equipment, their ability to mount an organized defense. We're talking about technology that can apparently render modern military equipment useless, and the Russians and Chinese are now trying to figure out how. This is bigger than just one raid. This is about technological superiority that goes beyond what most people understand. If the United States has the capability to simply turn off an adversary's military technology, that changes everything. Every nation that relies on imported military equipment, every country that has Russian or Chinese weapons systems, they're all asking the same question right now. Would it work against us too? Fort Bragg itself is significant here. This base is home to some of the most elite special operations forces in the American military. The fact that Trump chose to honor the operators there, that he brought First Lady Melania Trump with him to meet with the families, this wasn't just a photo opportunity. This was the commander-in-chief telling his special operations community, "I will send you on the hardest missions imaginable, and I will stand with you when you complete them." But Trump's speech at Fort Bragg revealed something else. Something about the domestic politics swirling around this operation. He went after Democrats, warning that if they win the midterm elections, they'll strip away military funding. They'll rename Fort Bragg back to Fort Liberty. As President Biden had done, they'll essentially undo everything he's building. He even endorsed Michael Whatley, the former Republican National Committee chairman running for Senate in North Carolina, saying that if Whatley wins, the military will be protected, but if he loses, Democrats will dismantle the armed forces. This is where the story gets complicated, because we're not just talking about a military operation anymore. We're talking about how that operation gets used politically. Trump is positioning himself as the strong military president, the one who got Maduro, the one who demonstrated American power on the world stage, and he's using that narrative to drive support for Republican candidates in the midterms. Whether you think that's appropriate or not, it's happening, and it's shaping how Americans perceive this entire operation. Now let's talk about what happened after the raid, because this is where things get really interesting from a geopolitical standpoint. Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, took over as interim leader of Venezuela. And here's what's fascinating. She publicly defended Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores, calling them innocent, rejecting all the charges that led to their arrest. But at the same time, her government has been cooperating with the United States on a massive scale. In late January, the United States and the Rodriguez interim government signed a huge energy deal. American companies are now marketing Venezuelan crude oil. But here's the catch. All the revenue goes into accounts controlled by the United States government. The American government then distributes that money at its discretion. Think about what that means. Venezuela is producing oil, but they don't control their own revenue. The United States does. We've essentially taken control of a major portion of Venezuelan economic output without firing a shot beyond the initial raid. This is economic warfare elevated to a new level. It's not sanctions anymore. It's not just freezing assets. It's actually controlling the flow of money from a country's natural resources, and the interim Venezuelan government is going along with it. Why? Because they probably don't have a choice. Because the alternative is worse. Because the United States just demonstrated exactly what it's willing to do. Trump has talked about having extraordinary relations with Venezuela's interim leadership. He's talked about cooperation on oil revenue and transition planning. But let's be clear about what's really happening here. This isn't cooperation between equals. This is a subordinate relationship. Venezuela needs American recognition and support to maintain any legitimacy on the world stage. The United States is leveraging that need to restructure Venezuela's entire economic relationship with the outside world. And this is all happening while Maduro sits in a federal courthouse in New York facing drug trafficking charges. The images of him being escorted by U.S. Marshals, a man who was president of a country just weeks before, are surreal. This is unprecedented in modern history. When was the last time a sitting head of state was captured by a foreign military and put on trial? You have to go back generations to find a comparable situation. But here's what keeps me up at night about all of this, and what should concern anyone paying attention to international relations. Where does this end? If the United States can justify a military raid to capture a head of state because of drug trafficking charges, what's the limiting principle? Are there other leaders we might target? Trump has been talking tough about Iran, mentioning potentially very traumatic consequences if they don't make a deal. The United States has deployed a second aircraft carrier, the USS Ford, to the Middle East. Fort Bragg houses units that could be deployed to that region. Are we looking at another Operation Absolute Resolve, but this time in the Persian Gulf? The implications of what happened in Venezuela ripple far beyond Latin America. Every authoritarian leader, every strongman, every president who has antagonized the United States is now looking over their shoulder, wondering if they're next. American military planners have just added a new tool to their toolkit, the decapitation strike against a sitting government. That fundamentally changes the calculus of international relations. And it's not just authoritarian leaders who should be concerned. Our allies are watching this too. They're asking questions about international law, about sovereignty, about what precedent this sets. Because if the United States can do this to Venezuela, if we can justify it based on domestic criminal charges, what stops other countries from doing the same? What stops Russia from claiming they need to capture a Ukrainian leader for war crimes? What stops China from claiming they need to capture a Taiwanese leader for separatism? The door we've opened here might be one we wish we'd kept closed. The Pentagon has been notably quiet about which specific units carried out this operation. The identities of the operators remain classified. That's standard procedure for special operations. But that silence also means we don't have a full picture of what happened that night. We know 3 pilots were wounded. We know 7 American soldiers in total were injured. We know 83 people died on the Venezuelan side, including 32 Cubans. But what we don't know could fill a book. What were the rules of engagement? How much civilian infrastructure was damaged? Were there any civilian casualties that haven't been reported? How many firefights occurred beyond the initial contact at the landing zone? Trump has described the operators involved as incredibly talented, patriotic people who love their country, people who couldn't be stopped. And I have no doubt that's true. These are professionals who train for the most difficult missions imaginable. But even the best operators in the world are only as good as the mission they're given. And the question we should be asking isn't whether they executed the mission well, it's whether the mission should have been executed at all. There's also this detail about recruitment that Trump mentioned in his Fort Bragg speech. He said recruitment is booming, that the military is stronger and more important than ever. And if this operation does anything, it probably does boost recruitment. Young people who want to be part of something bigger, who want to prove themselves in the most challenging environments, they're going to look at Operation Absolute Resolve and think that's exactly where they want to be. The military becomes more attractive when it's seen as powerful and successful. Whether that's a good thing or not depends entirely on what we're asking those recruits to do once they sign up. The bigger story here isn't just about Venezuela or Maduro or even Trump. It's about American power and how we choose to use it. It's about the kinds of precedents we set and the world we create through our actions. It's about whether might makes right, or whether there are still rules that even the most powerful nation on earth should follow. Because here's the thing, we won this round. We got Maduro. The operation was, by military standards, a success. But success in battle doesn't always translate to success in the broader strategic picture. We now own Venezuela's problems. We're now responsible for what comes next in that country. We've created a situation where we have to manage a transition government, control their oil revenue, and somehow rebuild a country that we just attacked. That's not a burden we necessarily wanted, but it's one we now have. And the world is watching all of this unfold. They're watching how we handle the aftermath. They're watching what we do with Maduro in court. They're watching how we manage our relationship with the Rodriguez government. They're watching whether this becomes a template for future operations or a one-off event. And based on what they see, they're making decisions about how to deal with the United States going forward. So where does this leave us? We're living in a moment where the rules of international engagement have fundamentally shifted, where American military power has been demonstrated in a way that can't be ignored, where the line between law enforcement and military action has been blurred beyond recognition, where the precedent for capturing foreign leaders has been set, and there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. Operation Absolute Resolve changed everything, and we're only just beginning to understand what that means.